love a good tabletop RPG, y'all, and I've even run my very own D&D campaigns before. And while those campaigns were held together with scotch tape and silly string, they were still oh so fun. I forget how it came up initially, but during one of the streams we got talking about D&D and about which classes we thought the Twist Boys would be if they happened to be in that game system. So today I figured I'd give y'all the full breakdown of my thoughts on the matter. And like always, we'll be talking about EN server story content, so consider this your spoiler warning. Now then, let's start off with Idia this time, because Idia is getting a very special class, the Dungeon Master class, which technically isn't an actual class, but I can't really see him being anything else other than the DM here. I suppose if I had to give him a character class, he'd be an artificer since he crafts all sorts of gizmos and thingamabobs, but the guy is just so clearly DM coded. I mean, the dude literally tries to rewrite the world to suit his needs during book 6, and you can't convince me that he wouldn't be absolutely fantastic at creating homebrew campaigns. Plus, I think Idia is likely one of the only characters in Twist who has the game knowledge required to not only lead a campaign, but to teach others how to play, without being overly cruel like, say, Azul might be. We often see Idia referencing video games, some of which are totally RPGs, and in Book 6, he and Ortho even start assigning our previous overblottees different classes and characteristics based on their research stats. DM is too perfect a role for Idia to try to equate him to anything else here, and this also means that his section is comparatively small, but so it goes. I also suppose it would be a shame to leave Ortho all by his lonesome later on in the list, so let's talk about him here and now. Given Ortho's unique constitution and situation, I'm going to assign him the Paladin class and give him the Oath of Watchers. I feel like Ortho might also multi-class into Bard given his interest in theater and acting and his general extroverted nature, but I think his primary focus overall would be protecting his brother, his family, and by extension the world, so to suit this, he's going to mainly focus on his Paladin levels. The oath that he'll take in this case is focused around protecting the mortal realm from threats outside of it, which doesn't really seem like a problem Twisted Wonderland often faces unless you count you as a threat, but the phantoms and overblots I think can be worked to fit this role instead, which will give this oath more weight in universe. The Shroud family has been responsible for tending to the underworld and dealing with the worst of the worst overblot cases. They oversee the entire world and are not bound to anyone or anything other than their duty, as even world governments can't influence their decisions. This goal is noble, heroic, and a heavy burden, one that I think resonates with this specific oath. In Tasha's Cauldron, paladins that take this oath are described as ever vigilant in spotting the influence of extraplanar forces, often establishing a network of spies and informants to gather information on suspected cults. To a watcher, keeping a healthy suspicion and awareness about one's surroundings is as natural as wearing armor in battle. Styx has a vast network of staff who take on all sorts of responsibilities, including monitoring the world for blot incidents. As not only a member of Styx, but one of the founding family's descendants, Ortho is even more firmly tied to this mission and to this monitoring. He's got not only the whole human staff in the palm of his hand, but the entirety of Styx's technology under his control as well. He has a network of informants, the technology required to know exactly when and where an incident is happening, and he's even got a built-in blot detector, which is quite literally as natural to him as wearing armor in battle. These paladins are also noted in that same book to hone their minds, spirits, and bodies to be the ultimate weapon against such threats. This last line in particular resonates with Ortho well, as his whole entire body seems to be more or less created with the intention of recognizing and dealing with blot. We also know from Playful Land that Ortho can discreetly scan others' vitals to gain information about their intentions, which also likely includes their blot levels. We also know that Ortho is a fantastic weapon too, as he could have obliterated the school with a few technomatic beams in the Ghost Pride event. Everything that Ortho was created to be lends itself well to Styx's mission and to this oath, and I think the nature of a paladin's magic also works generically for Ortho. He's already playing this sort of role in Book 7 too, and given the parallels between generic divine powers, generically, and the generic association made with dragons and their source of their power, It just makes sense to me that this class and oath would be what Ortho would choose if he was in this sort of game system. Speaking of Malleus, I guess we'll be going in reverse order for this video since we've established Ignihide right off the bat. So let's dive into Diasomnia and chat about the dragon for a bit. Given that Malleus is in fact a dragon, and that the name of this game system is Dungeons & Dragons, and in this game system, dragons have classically been the final bosses, or at least one of the greater challenges, and since Malleus is currently acting, as of this recording, like a final boss in the released chapters of Book 7 in EN, he's getting assigned the BBG class, which is also technically not a class, but it is the role that best suits him given everything. Technically speaking, since he's a true dragon, he would be in the monster class, which is an actual thing, but it's rather broad, so you have to go to the specific monster type to glean information about what abilities or tendencies they actually have. Thankfully, Malleus is a dragon, and we know what color dragon he is since he hatches right before our eyes in Lilia's dream, so we can assign him the same dragon's characteristics for this game system, or so you would think, but it's a bit more complicated than that. You see, in D&D canon, black dragons like Malleus are naturally of the evil alignment. They are also considered to be, at least according to the Forgotten Realms wiki, the most vile-tempered and cruel of all chromatic dragons, which does not describe Malleus at all. While he may be a little selfish and a little less than understanding in some cases, he's not inherently evil or malicious. He's just a kiddo looking for friends to appreciate gargoyles with, and that's not even close to the crimes and atrocities black dragons are known for in D&D. His magic is largely fire-based, while black dragons are poison-based. Black dragons live in swamps, while Malleus lives in the mountains. Malleus loves ice cream because it cools him down, but black dragons like warmth. And most importantly of all, black dragons smell of rot and decay, and I do not believe that Malleus is in any way stinky. They could not be more different, and it is within that very difference that we find our plot for this D&D session that Idia is running, which isn't really the focus of this video, but it will be the focus for the rest of Malleus' section. Poor little Malleus is unlike all the other black dragons, as he just wants to have friends in a clan, but because he is in fact a black dragon, he gets unfairly judged by others and ostracized, which is a problem that Malleus does have to deal with in Twisted Wonderland. Perhaps in this D&D universe, he becomes jaded after so many rejections that when he's approached by a cultist under the guise of friendship, he's wary but desperate. The cultists may then endear themselves to Malleus in such a spectacular fashion that he ends up getting manipulated by them and therefore ends up terrorizing the region under their orders. Or perhaps there's an even bigger BBG hiding in the shadows behind Malleus, whispering promises of a world where his deepest desires and dreams will be realized. One where he can have friends and never worry about unfair associations his power brings, but only if he follows their commands and does their bidding. Will your group of adventurers persuade him to join your noble quest, or will you vanquish him once and for all? The choice is yours, but you best choose wisely. Now, if you did happen to make the case that Malleus was a dragonborn and not a true dragon, then I think he'd be a straight-up wizard. Yes, they are squishy and Malleus is not, but I think Malleus would have the time required to hit the books and become an excellent mage specializing in illusion, as his unique magic is more or less being forced into an illusionary reality, which is a real spell that wizards of the illusion subclass can learn. I also think this is the most open-ended of the magical schools because if you go a little off of the books, there are nearly infinite ways that illusions can work or function in a given game world, and at present Malleus' power is pretty much an infinite wellspring. And while draconic bloodline sorcerers exist, which might be a bit more of a natural path for Malleus to take, they are to my knowledge very elementally dependent, which Malleus is not. So I think a dragonborn wizard is a nice compromise that leaves enough room for Malleus to have more spells at his disposal while still being tied to his draconic nature. Moving on to Lilia now, I had no idea what to go with because this dude could conceivably be it all. He was a fighter, an explorer. You could technically count him as a rogue considering how he pops up out of nowhere all the time. He could fit into any of the magical classes. He's in the pop music club, so he could be a bard. He's got some sage wisdom and martial prowess, so he could be a monk. He's even got some bat friends, so he could be a druid. The list goes on and on. Lilia is multi-classing in everything, and I don't think anyone can stop him, which is a little bit of a problem for this consideration because I feel like there are arguments that can be made for him to fit into any and every box. But given his backstory, I think it would make the most sense to have Lilia be a warlock with an archfey patron. Warlocks are powerful casters whose power comes from a contract or other agreement with some sort of powerful entity or occult god or something of that nature. Sometimes it can also come from natural talent or from studying, but generally speaking, there is some sort of entity also involved. This power varies a little depending on the patron and the intentions of the individual, but I think the whims of the Feywild match the Lilia we know well. In Book 7, we find out a lot about Lilia's backstory, but briefly put, Lilia was taken in by Queen Maleficia when he was little, an orphan given another shot at life if he accepted being bound to the crown. While Malinor may or may not have also had a hand in this, I think it's undeniable that Queen Maleficia counts as an archfey given her position in the Briar Valley. Because Lilia was taken in, cared for, and trained by the crown, it was likely assumed that he would pay back this kindness with his services once he could, which formed a contract of sorts between him and the crown for our consideration. Because of this, Lilia became the General of the Right during the war, sworn to protect Malinor, and when subsequently unfairly deposed by the Council Senate Orb Things when Malinor met her fate. Yet despite this tragedy, Maleficia continued to rely on Lilia, albeit in secret, to hatch Malleus, a task that she would have never given him if she truly felt scorned by him. I think this kind of story works very well for a character in this class with this focus that is also Fey, as Lilia more or less made a contract with an archfey, Maleficia, when his life was saved by her, and she never abandoned him even in such unfortunate circumstances, so he never really lost his powers or link to his patron. The tasks he took on during the war and after could be considered part of this pact or part of his responsibilities, which could add another layer of depth to his character in this RPG context. At some point, it could have stopped being merely duty and became true, genuine care, which I think is what happened during the hatching struggles, adding an even more delicious flavor. It just suits him, and while this isn't the only class that I think would allow him to do a lot of the things that he already does, or the only class that suits his talents, as we discussed at the beginning of his section, it does easily insert into his established narrative. So I can't help but feel that this warlock with an archfey patron classification just works. I also think because of where I've placed Lilia, that Silver would never have been given the opportunity to make a contract, so he couldn't possibly be a warlock. Lilia would have likely taught him how to avoid all of the tricky Fey pitfalls, and instead trained Silver to be an excellent fighter who dabbles a bit in druid. I originally wanted to make Silver a paladin of devotion since I think it suits his overall narrative. However, the description is extremely reminiscent of the Dawn Knights aesthetic, and I think Lilia would have steered Silver away from this in order to make his life in the Briar Valley easier. And I also don't want to fully equate Silver to his biological father because they really aren't the same person. Silver does retain a lot of the characteristics of the Dawn Knight, like his gentleness and his desire for peace, but they're not the same. And because that class, the Paladin of Devotion, started to really just feel like the Dawn Knight, I really just don't want to associate it with Silver. Instead, I think that Lilia would have trained him as a fighter in this way to kind of steer him away from that Paladin path. And it probably also would have been very difficult for Silver to have become tied to a lawful deity as one of Malleus's guards, since your focus would have to be on the dragon and not on any sort of divine fealty. And while Sebek might argue that Malleus is in fact a god, I firmly disagree. So fighter it is for Silver. I think Lilia would have trained him in this crossover RPG world as a cavalier specifically, who multi-classes as a druid just enough to unlock the skills required to justify Silver's ties to nature. Talking with animals and being a gentle friend to nature is something that defines Silver's character and bolsters his compassionate nature, so it would be impossible to me for him to not have some sort of druidic experience. Cavaliers are also a subclass that works with animals, specifically mounts, which also connects to Silver well since he's in the Equestrian Club. Yet from what I understand, this class also offers some flexibility, so these characters aren't relying wholly on their animal partners to be successful inside and outside of combat. Fighters aren't a class that I have extensive knowledge on, but it seems like Cavaliers are the most flexible team-based flavor, which I think works fantastically for Silver as well. Of all the boys, I feel like Silver, Rook, and Kalim are really the only ones who would willingly collaborate with others without too many questions. Silver specifically works closely with Sebek and the other royal guards to protect Malleus, so he's likely used to fighting in teams. While he can, of course, hold his own, I think he likely enjoys camaraderie, which lends itself well to the skills of this subclass. Cavaliers are the banner raisers, the valiant warriors who lead the charge into battle, and I think we've been seeing Silver fill those shoes throughout Book 7. He's the one that goes after Malleus to ensure he has no regrets. He's the one leading us through the dream world so that we can save the actual world. And I have no doubt that he's going to be one of the most influential players during the climactic end of this book. This multi-class pairing and subclass I think gives Silver the space to have the strength of a fighter, the valor of a hero, and the tenderness of compassion that ultimately defines his character. So that's what I've decided to give him here. Sebek now is probably going to be pretty obvious. He is a paladin of the crown. There is no way he could be devoted to anyone other than Malleus and the Briar Valley, and there is no way this devotion doesn't lead him to being a paladin. He argued that Malleus was a god. I disagreed, but here we are. Technically speaking, this oath isn't tied to divinity specifically, but to a lord or sovereign, who could be divine in some way, but they don't have to be. And typically this oath involves the tenets of loyalty, courage, law, and responsibility. All things which I think Sebek already has a good handle on, at least when it comes to his own land. This oath and those who take it are described in the Adventurer's Guide to be the watchful guardians on the walls, standing against the chaotic tides of barbarism that threaten to tear down all that civilization has built, and are commonly known as guardians, exemplars, or sentinels. Sebek watches Malleus like a hawk, sometimes to Malleus's detriment, as we can see in Book 6 when the dragon has enough of Sebek's constant vigilance and pleas to ramshackle for a break. While he can sometimes be overbearing, Sebek is earnest and loyal to a degree that is honestly unfathomable to me. Sebek's entire life revolves around serving his lord and country, which makes this oath perfect for him. It is also stated in that book that often, paladins who swear this oath are members of an order of knighthood in service to a nation or sovereign, and undergo their oath as part of their admission to the order's ranks. Which would make a lot of sense for Sebek then, since he's someone who's gunning it to be a royal guard. I would also think that in this sort of RPG universe, the Briar Valley would likely require the royal guards to take on this sort of oath. And since Sebek basically takes this oath in Book 7 when he's recognized by Bauer in Lilia's dream, I think he'd unlock all his latent potential with this divine backing, even if it's just in the dream world. But I do think it's a path that he would walk down afterwards too, as I just can't envision Sebek doing anything else. So for me, he cannot be anything other than this. I don't think he'd even want to multi-class, honestly. He probably just wants to devote himself solely to this role, given his nature. So that's that for him. Now then, moving on to Honfiore, I think we can all agree that Vil is the mom friend of the twst cast. And there is no D&D class more emblematic of this, in my opinion, than that of the cleric. But Vil's not going to be your happy fun time cutesy herbalist cleric, no, no, no. Vil would be a cleric of the death domain. I don't think Vil is particularly fond of the types of folks who frequent this domain, nor do I think he'd be down to raise the dead like a grave domain cleric would, but he is known for creating incredibly vile and potent poisons, so I think to hone those skills he would have had to go down a slightly darker path. Given what we see in Vil's hometown event regarding the references to the Fairest Queen, I don't actually think this death focus would be as negatively perceived in universe as it might be in ours. In fact, Vil might have chosen this path specifically because the Fairest Queen was also a death domain cleric. Who knows? But I think this connection could make the poison apple motif a bit more meaningful. finding beauty in that which is usually regarded as hideous is a spin I could see this taking on in this RPG crossover, and it could justify those more horror-esque nods to the queen that we see in Tapis Rouge, like eating hearts and skull apples and all that jazz. This would also provide enough justification for this path to work with Vil's current goals and popularity, as he could use this focus to draw parallels between himself and the fairest queen, which is something that he currently also does. We also know from Tapis Rouge and various other vignettes that Vil is a deft hand at potion creation, which I think fits the cleric vibe generically. He and his father bonded over crafting cosmetics together, so I can see Vil also being drawn to the cleric role due to this, but I don't think he would have progressed enough or picked a domain until he got closer to attending NRC, or even after he enrolled, since we know from his Bloom birthday vignette that he didn't really practice magic at all until coming to the school. Given Pomfiore's focus on poisons, including their exclusive garden of toxic herbs, I think being placed here and eventually becoming the House Warden could have also been reason enough for Vil to have felt drawn to the Death Domain. This domain allows clerics to command spells which either include poison or life force, which I think works well for Vil's unique magic. Sure, he could turn your apple juice into a vile poison, but he could also probably turn it into an elixir that cures your ailments. Curses and blessings are just two sides of the same coin, after all, with the intention put behind the magic determining which of the two monikers that magic receives. So just because Vil's good at poisons doesn't mean he can't also be a healer. Plus, at higher levels, these clerics also unlock Cloud Kill, which functions in a very similar manner to that stunt that Vil pulled during his overblot with the poisonous smoke, so I think, all in all, this role is rather fitting. Rook Hunt now is going to be a ranger, specifically a hunter, because of course he is. However, he's also going to multi-class into bard. That or he just mistakenly put all his points into charisma, but I think it's much more likely that he was fully a hunter until he met Vil and transferred to Pomfiore, at which point he began starting to put levels towards bard. This, I think, fits his transformation from Savannah Claw Rook to Pomfiore Rook, although I also suspect he's always kind of been dabbling in bardism ever since he was born. As a ranger primarily, though, Rook would be able to retain all of the same tracking and hunting qualities he's known for in the Twist universe in the RPG universe. I have no idea what he'd select as his favorite prey. Maybe Beastman? Lion Beastman specifically, given his intense interest in Leona? But he's also intensely interested in most folks, so it's still a bit unclear. Same thing with his favorite terrain. I think it would make sense for him to pick the plains because of the savannah, but his family also travels a lot, presumably, so I don't really know where he spent most of his time and where he would feel most comfortable. And as a hunter, he receives special bonuses and abilities that aid him in, you guessed it, hunting, which are all things that Rook already does and possesses. Even his special magic is pretty similar to some of the abilities that rangers have, like Locate Creature, which functions more or less in the exact same manner as his unique magic, with a few more limitations, of course. But regardless, this spell can be unlocked at level 13 and is available for both the Bard and Ranger classes, so it works out well for Rook. I also really don't know what else to say about him in this regard, because I feel like this class pairing is probably the most obvious and self-explanatory one in this list. Now, perhaps there's one other individual that we will get to that may have something very similar, but Rook is just ridiculously charismatic and understands theater to an unnatural degree, so it only makes sense that he would have a little bit of bard in him as well as this ranger-hunter combo. His Pomfiore dorm uniform is literally just a bard outfit too, so he can't even attempt to beat these allegations, and that's kinda it. That's all I got. Rook's just Rook in every universe, apparently. But moving on to Epel, this kid is totally a barbarian, and while he isn't as trigger-happy as another barbarian we'll get to later on in this list, Epel does enjoy getting into scuffles and fighting, and we get at least one fine example of him raging during the Harvest and Sledathon, so he's not going to beat the allegations here. Barbarians are battle-hardened warriors that often fly into rages when they are fighting, which has become the dominant feature of this class. Epel does get heated and does so often enough that I think that this class can be justified for him, even if he doesn't turn red. And I think his desires to become someone who is beefy and bulky and strong all can also connect to this too. Barbarians are generally depicted as being jacked, so I can see Epel choosing this class and training in it in an attempt to become jacked. While his attempts may not have created those muscles, they have fueled him with the power to tackle those twice his size. And with a little extra training, I think he'd be a formidable force. He also continues to choose sportier activities like spell drive and involve himself in fights like in White Rabbit Fest, so even if someone like Vil would rather Epel pursue cleric or some other class that fits Epel's cutesy image, I think that Epel himself will be sticking to barbarian with his full chest. Another reason I wanted to give Epel this class is because one of the subclasses, Path of the Ancestral Guardian, just feels like a very Epel thing. If there was one thing you needed to know about Epel, it is that above all else, he loves his hometown. As I've discussed many times on this channel, Epel is wholly dedicated to helping revitalize Harveston, and there is no way he's going to leave this little village. Now, as far as I'm aware, Harveston is not super into ancestry per se, but it does seem like family is a very important thing there, so I can see this path working in that regard. Epel wants to protect his family, his town, and their way of life, which I think resonates with this path, even if the specifics are not the same. I can't imagine Epel getting a bunch of tattoos to celebrate his heritage in the same way as many of these barbarians are noted to do in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but he will absolutely be dedicating his existence to his hometown. So in that way, I think Epel having a more spiritual leaning connection to his hometown would be welcomed by him and would further bolster the tension perhaps between Epel and Vil. I don't think Vil would want to sever this connection, not in the slightest, but it will likely become a point of contention in Epel's view of Vil, similar to how he didn't understand Vil's accent request at first. I also think it would be really funny to see Epel charging at someone who pissed him off with the entirety of his ancestral spirits behind him all shouting in Harvestonese. Unless, of course, that person was you. In which case, I think it would be terrifying. But it would still be impressive in either case. But it's time to move on to Scarabia, and we'll start off with Kalim. Now for Kalim, I pegged him as a druid right off the cuff because he loves animals so much and just wants everyone to get along and be in harmony with one another, so being a nature-loving druid just seemed to make sense. The larger problem was figuring out what kind of druid he would be. I ultimately decided on the Circle of the Land because I think it would make sense for his family to have some connections with these types of ancient mystics, secret society type folks, given their position and influence in the region. So when Kalim expressed interest in becoming a druid, they likely contacted members of this circle to induct him. Therefore, it is probably most logical for Kalim to be joining this circle in the desert subset, since he lives in the Scalding Sands, which is majorly desert from what we know. The spells of this circle, though, have more to do with the sand and the earth than the water of Kalim's Oasis Maker. I suppose since his family is one of the merchants, it might make sense for them to have connections with other folks in other parts of the world, and therefore they could have had Kalim inducted on the coast instead, which would provide spells that are much more useful to the Scalding Sands than the Insect Plague, for instance, which desert druids get. This would make more thematic sense for Kalim, since he'd be able to control water, Misty Step his way out of danger during attempts on his life, conjure elementals to help himself or his people, and scry to predict droughts or famines or other calamities that could befall his homeland. How his family would have been able to convince these druids would be a mystery, as I don't think they actually care all that much about money, but perhaps a friend of a friend would have lent them a favor and it would have worked out in Kalim's favor to allow him this specific type of opportunity. Being in this circle would just justify Kalim's already existing abilities, and then the druid overarching theme would help with his animal-loving and nature-loving and people-loving nature. The druids on the whole are more connected to the land and to the creatures that dwell within it, and there's no saying that that can't also include people, as Kalim is pretty extroverted as well. So I think with all of these factors combined, and with this particular class allowing him to retain some of his magic prowess as authentically as possible, this would be where I would put him. Jamil, though, I think is going to be a rogue given his unique skill set protecting Kalim and keeping everything else in order behind the scenes. Rogues are typically very sneaky individuals who usually are into shadier business, and from what we see of Jamil in Book 4, it doesn't seem like he minds shady business all that much. He was willing to kind of almost let some of the characters die in the desert to get what he wanted. And that's a pretty roguish thing to do in my book, from what I know. So, I think that he could fit in this role well. And while it is clear that Jamil wants to step out of Kalim's shadow and be recognized for who he is, I think he had to pick a path pretty early on in life that could work in favor of the Aseems, given his position. And I think his talents just lend to the roguish lifestyle. Specifically, a soul knife rogue. Now, these rogues are very special because they hone psychic abilities, which is in line with Jamil's unique magic's focus. While these rogues typically use their mind powers to harm others, fighting them with their own consciousness, I can see the Aseems making use of Jamil's power to maybe find out information on their competition or even just silently defeat threats to Kalim and the family. It also would have provided enough space for Jamil to create his unique magic or come to possess it, as if he was focusing on this more psychic side of the shadows, it's likely that his mind control powers would have just developed naturally. We also recently learned during Jamil's dream in Book 7, spoilers by the way, Kalim mentions one rather startling occurrence of an attempted kidnapping or murder, it is unclear, that Jamil was able to field by the use of his magic. I'm personally of the opinion that Jamil probably used his special magic during this confrontation to turn those would-be kidnappers and or murderers, again, unclear, on each other, or at least convince them to not harm him and Kalim with his mind-controlling powers. This feels like a very roguey thing to do, because you're essentially just manipulating other people into doing your bidding for them, using some sort of charisma perhaps, but I guess in Jamil's case, it was still technically the psychic powers. But regardless, you're still manipulating the situation and other people's feelings to get them either against each other or doing something that you want them to do, which is pretty typical of rogues. And this specific set of rogues, again, just has the psychic powers to be able to connect it to Jamil and how he usually operates anyways. I think it's also mentioned in the description of the subclass in Tasha's Cauldron that some wood elves or elves generically choose to walk this path to protect their forests or their homelands. And so this subclass of the soul knife isn't all dastardly business. It can have a positive connotation. It just really depends on the intention of the person who's pursuing it. And I think in Jamil's case, given all that he's been through, he can use this power for good and likely will use it for good in the future. At least that's my hope for him anyway. But regardless, this was the most logical connection I could make for him, in my brain anyways. So that's what I'm giving him here. So moving into Octava now, we'll start with Azul. And Azul is a bit hard to pick for because I think he could fit into a couple of different classes pretty easily. However, I ultimately decided on Warlock because the whole concept of Warlock, as I understand it, is that a contract or agreement has to be made in some sort of occult adjacent entity or god or some sort of person that has powers that you want and you need, but you can't do it unless you sign on the dotted line. And no one in Twist is as synonymous with contracts and deals as Azul. He is the deal maker of Twist. His unique magic is literally filtered through a contract, and I wouldn't be surprised if he eventually became a warlock patron himself. But for right now, he's just a warlock who's made a pact with the Fathomless. This, I think, is the most natural patron for Azul to have run across, given that he is directly tied to the sea and specifically to the cold, dark depths, much like how the Fathomless are described. I think in his original pursuit of power as a youngster, Azul may have learned about the Fathomless and turned to them for help learning magic, or taking revenge on his bullies, or some other like pursuit. It might have even been possible that Azul's special magic came about from this joint study with this entity in this little crossover world. Who knows? But the abilities he would have gained from this deal just naturally suit Azul, given that he is a merman octopus. He would gain the ability to summon tentacles, breathe underwater, which he could technically already do, but he also gets resistance to cold damage, which I suppose you could also say he technically already has. And he will eventually also gain the ability to heal folks, hold them down or impede their movement without fear of his concentration being broken, and teleport himself into the depths. To be honest, the fact that most of these abilities center around tentacles and Azul's very nature as an octopus merman are kinda what my brain ended up connecting the most. But I do think that these abilities lend themselves to Azul's existing strengths and just make him even more formidable. It feels like a vibe. It feels like an Azul thing. It just seems to suit him so well. And I think some of those other little benefits, like being able to teleport himself or being able to heal people, it seems to just work for him. Everything has a practical use, and he's smart enough to figure out good uses for the things that aren't obvious at first. All of that aside, you know that Azul has this deal with this entity memorized down to the very last dot, and he's going to capitalize on every little thing that he can. I also think Azul's reluctance to be indebted could also be linked to this class, since he might be extra wary of making deals now that he's made one with this patron. Maybe there were some hard lessons he had to learn, or maybe he just doesn't want to jeopardize his position with his patron. I'm not entirely sure. It could be a mix of both. But I think these reasons could connect that piece to Azul too, and perhaps provide some in-universe reasoning for him to retain these characteristics in this RPG world. I know that I usually try to stray away from connecting Azul to Octopus because I feel like that's a little cliche. However, in this context, I just think that it makes the most sense to connect him to this particular path and to this particular patron, because it would justify a lot of his current characteristics in this new world, and it would allow him to retain a lot more of his merman heritage a bit more organically, I think. So that's what I ended up giving him here. Next up is Jade, who is absolutely a rogue. But of course, the main question is, which rogue? I had originally wanted to place him in Assassin because the guy could absolutely just make you disappear at the drop of a hat, at any point in time, without facing any sort of repercussions. But I found a subclass that suits his actual abilities way better, so Jade will be an Inquisitive rogue instead. Zenithor's Guide to Everything describes these rogues as individuals who rely on your sharp eye for detail, but also on your finely honed ability to read the words and deeds of other creatures to determine their true intent. You excel at defeating creatures that hide among and prey upon ordinary folk, and your mastery of lore and your sharp eye make you well equipped to expose and end hidden evils. Which sounds just like Jade, right? Well, perhaps if you swapped exposing hidden evils with committing hidden evils, it would suit him a little bit better. But the overall vibe of being able to see right through people is something that does resonate with Jade. He likes to muddy the water about himself, but he's got an excellent understanding of others. His research and insight are what allow him to do so well helping Vil for those days in his dorm uniform vignette, fooled Azul and Jack in Bean's Day with the durian juice, and reveal the true culprit behind Book 4's actions in that book. And Jade's special magic also plays into this sort of role as well, since if you look him in the eye, a big theme for this type of rogue, you'll have to tell him the truth and nothing but the truth, which is a real inquisitive move, no? There are 4 abilities that have I in the name for these types of rogues, and guess who also has a very important I? Jade! Anticipating others' moves and intentions are his bread and butter, and it's also the same for these types of rogues. And I think most of Jade's actions are also really intentional in the same way as these characters are meant to act, even though his reasoning is a little bit more dubious. Floyd makes a point during Bean's Day that mores are cowardly at heart and don't strike unless they are certain they can win, or something along those lines. And Jade may appear more composed, but I think he's the exact same way, and I think that really connects to this type of rogue. He wants to ensure that his actions will be fruitful, and to ensure that he needs to have all the information he can at his fingertips, And the more information he gathers on more people, giving him all sorts of access to the types and patterns of different personalities, all to ensure whatever he's doing is able to be effective in the way that he wants it to, I think over time would have allowed him to develop this natural sense of knowing people's true intentions. And because of that, he may now have an easier time dealing with whoever he wants to deal with. But at the end of the day, I don't think Jade is ever going to stop that sort of deep dive into his people of interest, let's say. Now, he's not as anxious as Azul in this regard, but he's still so thoughtful and so aware. Plus, he does sneak attack folks in a way with those shocking comments, so there is that too, which is a very roguish thing to do. So I think just overall, this works for Jade. Floyd, though, on the other hand, is also going to be a warlock like Azul. However, his patron isn't the Fathomless. No. He's made a contract with an Archfey. How? I don't know, and he's not telling, but somehow, someway, he made this deal, and now he's got all sorts of fun powers at his disposal. I just can't help but feel like Floyd was just in a good mood one day when he was approached by a capricious fae who made an impossible demand of Floyd that he just did somehow. Like he just managed to do it and did so without complaint, which by all accounts should not have been possible, and yet he did. And the Archfey had no idea what to do besides become his patron because he wasn't expecting this turn of events. So how is he going to reward this eel that should not have been able to do this, but did? So now he's in a bind. So he gives him some fun powers, and then Floyd just goes off into the sunset, creating all sorts of chaos. It just seems like such a Floyd thing to have happen. And I can't imagine him being any other path now that I have crafted this little story in my head. And honestly, this probably works out best for both Floyd and his Archfey patron, if we're being honest, because Floyd, again, now has little powers at his disposal, and the Archfey has a never-ending entertainment source. I can just imagine this patron growing fond of watching whatever crazy things this little guy gets up to, that even though Floyd likely crossed them once or twice, they just can't help but to continue to support him. He's just their little guy. He's their little chaos gremlin. He's like their cat. And they just love him, and they can't stop. And Floyd, for his part, absolutely loves going buck wild with all the random fae things that they give him. I think Floyd might use the Fae Presence ability whenever he threatens to squeeze someone, since it unsettles all those who are near him. And he could use Misty Escape to get out of losing battles, or even to sneak up on opponents, because he doesn't really care that it's a disengage tool. I don't think Floyd would play by those rules. I think he would just use it however he wants to. And I think he'd just have a blast with whatever other things he has access to. And like the chaos of the Feywild just speaks to Floyd's general MO. So having these powers despite being in a place where the Fae are scarce, I guess? It's never really discussed how many Fae are in the Coral Sea versus on land, or if there are like merfae. That'd be interesting to find out one day. But I just can't imagine that there's too many Fae under the sea, if they even exist there at all. So I'm not quite sure how all of this would have happened. But it's just such a random occurrence that I think it really just fits Floyd's vibe. Although that's kind of really just the connection, the chaos, which I guess could technically be accomplished with a fiend patron too. But I just like the spontaneity and absurdity of Floyd completing an impossible task successfully, and I associate this sort of scenario much more heavily with the Fae. So that's where I landed with him. I suppose from a story perspective, it would make more sense for him to be like an arcane trickster rogue, as he and Jade would have been trained together by their family, and this specific subclass allows for tomfoolery. But I also think it's just as likely for Floyd to have started on the rogue path before taking a hard left into warlock just because it happened to work out, and I feel like his family would be supportive enough, so there you go. Now then, starting off Savannah Claw, we have Leona, and Leona is going to be a rogue. Surprise, surprise. He's a very edgy boy after all, so I think it's fitting for him to be in this class, and I think he would have chosen or just naturally became a mastermind within it. Leona's whole shtick is having brains over bronze, even though he also has brawn, like the character he's twisted from, Scar. Book 2 is all about his elaborate plot to take down Malleus and all the little strings he pulls in order to do so, which is what this subclass is known for. They love tactics, manipulation, misdirection, and throughout the story we can see Leona make use of these things in various situations that are not limited to Book 2. In the Fairy Gala remix, he's able to convince Jack to join the Sticky Fingers crew by crafting his words to manipulate Jack's desires to ensure his cooperation. In Cloud Calling on the Savannah, we get multiple examples of Leona using tactics to outsmart his opponents, whether they be Neji, Cheka, or the royal guards in the ring. In Playful Land, he's able to convince the entire group to move on without him using his brain, and then he locks up all the puppets using that same brain, only to then turn into a puppet after all of that effort by virtue of his own hubris, but, it happens. But regardless, all of his actions involve some form of calculation, and he's very good at targeting folks' weaknesses in order to exploit them for his own gain. He's also got the charisma of a boss, and he's regarded as such in Savannah Claw, so he's got that going for him too. Given his position in the government of his homeland as well, it's likely that he'll continue to form connections that he can exploit for his own personal gain long after he's graduated. He might even become the spy master of the Sunset Savannah, with a whole web of underlings at his disposal, feeding him information and doing his bidding. He might actually affect a whole lot of change that way, honestly, and it would also somewhat be in line with what Scar does, given his network of hyena buddies who are willing to do his bidding with little persuasion. That's all speculation on my part, but I can see it happening in the future, and I think given how often we see Leona plotting and playing off of others' strengths and weaknesses just for his own benefit, it's hard for me to slot him anywhere else than a mastermind rogue, so that's what he's getting here. Ruggie, as well, is getting a pretty fitting role, if I do say so myself, and it is that of a rogue thief. It's a bit unoriginal, I know, but we do have a couple of different instances of Ruggie being an actual thief in-game. He's involved in the very first Fairy Gala specifically because he has sticky fingers. We see him talk about swiping Leona's belongings in Book 3. Leona cautions Jack against informing Ruggie that Playful Land is giving out tickets because of his reselling ways. He may or may not have had a run-in with the law back home because of his sticky fingers, as evidenced by the first Halloween event and Book 6 little whisperings between him and Leona. And there are probably other examples I'm forgetting here too. All of that is to say that Ruggie already has the skills necessary to be a thief and has likely already used them to be a thief. I mean, the guy literally swaps a tiara and steals it, so I think it's very hard for him to beat these allegations, and therefore, he just has to be a thief in D&D. It's not a stretch of the mind, it just is. And because of that, his section is going to be rather short, because I've presented pretty much all the textual evidence I think I need for him being a thief, so I don't really know what else I could elaborate on here. Ruggie just is a thief. Thief is Ruggie. That is how it goes. That is just life. Jack, on the other hand, is much too noble to be any form of rogue. And while I think he could fit in a few different classes, I found that the one that best fits my idea of him and his current abilities is to be a druid of the Circle of the Moon. Now, Jack doesn't strike me as a tree hugger, but he does take good care of his cactus, and he loves that little plant so much he tries to embody it during the Fairy Gala remix. I think it's also mentioned in one of his birthday cards that he challenges animals back home to races and to improve his skills, so I think he's got enough connections to nature to generically connect him to druid. The bigger reason that I picked this class for him is because of the subclass, the Circle of the Moon. This allows druids to use wild shape, which is basically what Jack's unique magic is, so I think this is the most natural tie-in for him to retain his abilities and his characteristics in this RPG universe. I have a funny feeling that whatever motivations manifested Jack's unique magic in the Twisted Wonderland universe would be aligned with his reasoning for picking the druid class and this particular subclass. I can imagine Jack seeking to commune with nature to unlock his natural talents, and in doing so he began to look at other creatures and their abilities and compare those to himself as a form of training or perhaps some checkpoints. Over time, this comparing and contrasting probably led him to pursuing this circle so that he could push his own boundaries just as far as those other animals, and his observations might have led to some discoveries of how to use their abilities too. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but I feel like connecting folks to classes that allow them to inhabit some of their more canonical characteristics from twst is probably the best route to go about for this type of consideration, as I feel like it just naturally will fit them a bit better. So I think that even though Jack doesn't really feel like a druid type, he feels a lot more like a fighter or a paladin. This really just lets him do the things that he's capable of currently in twst, and I feel like that's enough of a valid reason to really tie him to this here. Or at least that's how my mind has rationalized this whole connection for him. So that's my thoughts on the matter here. Moving into Heartstable, we'll start off with a Riddle, and now for Riddle, I picked a class and subclass combo that has nothing to do with his special magic. In fact, it even requires him to be a different race. However, once I read the abilities, it was all over. It was the only combo I could see fitting him now, and that's what I'm going to give him. It's the Barbarian on the Path of the Battle Rager. Is Riddle a dwarf? No. But do I think it's incredibly funny to give this short king a dwarvish path? Absolutely. Now, aside from haha short, my reasoning also has to do with the type of armor barbarians of this path tend to wear, the bulky spiked pieces. Once you've reached level 14, you unlock the ability Spiked Retribution, which adds piercing damage to those you attack while you're raging, provided you are also wearing spiked armor. For some reason, when I read this, I immediately thought about rose thorns, and then this path just clicked for Riddle. Riddle is basically the Queen of Hearts, and outside of beheading, she is most known for her roses. Part of Heartstable's whole aesthetic is the rose garden, and there are various rules that dictate what color the roses need to be at any given time due to whatever event may be happening at that time. Riddle also can be a little thorny if you aren't following the rules, and part of his overblot aesthetic is also thorns. He tries to end some folks with rose bushes during that debacle, and, on a lighter note, Malleus even gives him a rose corsage during the Ghost Bride event to complete his outfit, remarking that when Riddle is wearing it, it carries more weight than any metal, and that Riddle must carry himself with the strength and nobility of the rose, which I think most of the time Riddle does. Even when he's raging, there's a certain level of reason in his actions, and I believe these barbarians hold their traditions near and dear to their hearts in a very similar way. To me, Riddle is more synonymous with roses than the queen, and while that's partially due to his last name, it's also due to his dual nature. He's very nice when he's not being crossed, much like a rose's petals. But once you set him off, the thorns come out in droves to poke and prod. These types of barbarians get very prickly when they're raging, which I think fits this duality for Riddle. So while he isn't a dwarf, I do think he'd be really successful with this combo, and so that's what I'm going to give him here. Now for Trey, I wanted to give him Monk, since I feel like he represents calm. He keeps Riddle relatively chill, helps out the other students with keeping their heads, and just seems like an overall chill guy. And monks, in my mind, are pretty chill and mindful overall, so the combo seemed like a no-brainer to me. That was until the subclasses, because each and every one that I read didn't seem like it fit Trey. I couldn't really get a read on which way he'd likely go, and I think that's intentional on Trey's part, since he parades himself around like the most normal guy on the face of the earth. But then I got an idea. A delicious idea, and for it, Trey is being relegated to the way of the Kensei. These monks specialize in weapons to the point where the weapons are essentially part of them. And to me, I think this works so well for Trey because I can see his weapons not being a blade, but being something a bit more unconventional. You see, equipped with a spatula and a cookie gun, Trey becomes an unstoppable force in the culinary arena. He becomes one with baking, a force of sugar and spice, an unfathomable tide of culinary experience where victory does indeed taste oh so sweet. While these kitchen tools are not conventional weapons, I think they can be used in a campaign with this subclass for some really fun shenanigans that also work well for Trey's overall character. He's a prolific baker that has a lot of practice with pastries, and his tools in the kitchen are almost like an extension of himself. Everyone on campus raves about Trey's sweets, so I can't imagine this not working for him when you spin this path in this way. Even his Zoom is adept with these implements, and that guy has no thumbs. So that whisk must simply be an extension of the Zoom, which means that it is an extension of Trey, which means that he's perfect for the path of Kensei. There is no other way. This just is it. This is what Trey has become, and I hope he's happy. Cater now is going to be a bard for sure. He's got the extroverted charisma to do well, is unafraid to approach a dragon, and even has some musical talent to boot. The question yet again is what subclass does Cater get put into, and it could be a few. But the one that I decided to go on here was the College of Glamour because I think it aligns with what we see of his goals so far. The guy is glued to Magicam, trying to get followers, likes, and subscribes any chance he gets. It seems like he'd like to be a celebrity or influencer of sorts, and while this desire may be driven by wanting to escape himself, I can see him succeeding in this college when he accepts himself as well. The college will allow a bard to cloak themselves in magic, thusly giving them more charisma and better chances that their performances succeed. At least that's what I got out of reading all of the text regarding this subclass, and I think that's kind of where Cater is going. Glamour can take many forms and incorporate various aesthetics, so I think Cater can still go down like the rockstar path without giving up these ideals. Plus, he might have been tempted to join this college due to Ville's influence, as his celebrity status and focus on beauty could have inspired Cater to focus on similar things. He's also friends with Lilia, who could have helped him learn a bit of Fae magic, which would also benefit him in this college since most of the magic comes from the Fae, or at least Fae sources. The later levels rely heavily on charisma to charm and persuade, and I don't think Cater is quite there yet, given what we see of him in the story, but I think he could get there if he focused more on himself and his desires. But like I said, there were a few other colleges I can just as easily see him joining, so this pairing is a little wishy-washy, but I still think it fits, so that's what he's getting here. Deuce now was a bit tricky because I feel like he'd be a fighter or a paladin based off of what we see in game and how Deuce deals with conflict. But I also think him turning over a new leaf to be an honor student might tempt him down the cleric path. Similarly to Ville, Deuce would not be your humble little herbalist. Rather, he'd be a cleric of the war domain. Deuce is no stranger to a scuffle and has likely been in many a fight prior to NRC and even now at NRC. One could liken these encounters to battles in a sort of war between delinquency and honor studentdom, and I think some of the perks of this subclass work well for Deuce and his special magic. Quite a few of the spells these clerics learn involve defense, which is Deuce's current specialty. You've got shields, guardians, and stone skin, which are directly related to defense, but you've also got things like freedom of movement and hold monster, which can be used defensively in certain contexts. War priests also have bonus attacks in combat based off their wisdom modifier, which Deuce might have, because wisdom is different from intelligence. So while Deuce can't do math, I have no doubt he wouldn't put a tomato in fruit salad, at least when he's in possession of the brain cell. But the most important feature I think that ties to Deuce is the Avatar of Battle ability gained at level 17, which would give him resistance to a whole slew of physical attacks. Given Deuce's backstory and his past delinquent ways, I feel like he'd likely have tough skin already, so eventually becoming resilient to all these things just makes sense. His special magic also being a spell that forces him to take and store damage also works well in this vein, I think, because Deuce still has to be able to withstand the incoming force, absorb it, then reflect it onto his opponent. He needs to be tanky to do this, and he likely needs to be able to patch himself up, a skill he likely learned a little bit about during his delinquency. So for Deuce to swap his focus to cleric to heal himself and others while also resisting the tides of battle lends a strength to him that I think is fitting. Perhaps his divine devotion could even be to the almighty Amalgachik, the combined divine consciousness of all those little chicks who gave up their lives so we could eat their eggs. Just a thought. Ace now is getting the most basic of basic subclass pairings because he's still really undecided with what he wants to do in life, so I have a hard time pairing him to something concrete or deep. But he does have a few talents that I can go off of, which eventually led me to give him the Rogue class and Arcane Trickster subclass. Even this subclass's description tells us that most adventurers fall into this classification, and it's one that lends itself well to mischief, which is totally an ace thing. He's got a passion and talent for sleight of hand magic, which we see multiple times throughout the story. In his dorm uniform vignette, he mystifies both Riddle and Cater. In the Fairy Gala remix, he uses his talents to swap out the staff. In his Soom Sitter story, he and his Soom use magic to try to swindle people. And over time, it becomes apparent that Ace loves these tricks just as much as he loves getting out of his responsibilities. Even this, I think, can lend itself well to the combo, as Ace, always trying to weasel his way out of everything without fail, I think can connect to a trickster of sorts, an unsuccessful trickster, but a trickster nonetheless. I also feel like this is the D&D equivalent of not really knowing what you wanted to do but still wanting to be able to have fun. And I think that's basically kind of what Ace is doing currently at NRC. You can do all sorts of things, but they don't really have a lot of substance per se, as some of the more dedicated or pigeonholed subclasses can be. And you also kind of can get relegated to like the Fool if you don't progress high enough in this skill tree with this subclass, which suits Ace at this point in time. He's the only member of the main cast that lacks a special magic right now, and I have no idea if he will even get one with how he's been going about things and how much he slacks off all the time. Of course, he still has his good points, like we discussed, as every arcane trickster who's worth their salt would have, but he's still not shedding those bad habits yet, so I'm not entirely sure what his potential will lead him to other than this. Last but not least today is Grim, who I think is a warlock who made a contract with a fiend, but because he didn't read the fine print, he lost his memory of the interaction. I just cannot help but feel like there is someone behind the scenes making sure Grim is in the best possible position to cause as much damage as possible, because Grim's entire being is an enigma even to himself. We have no idea where he came from, we had no idea what he was until book 6, and by that time he's begun to act a little weird around Blot. Grim has magic and he has potential, but he also has no knowledge of this world or his place in it. And it's just so odd because he already has this deeply rooted desire to be an NRC student, yet he doesn't even know what Halloween is. I think in a D&D context, he would probably be a tabaxi who made a contract with a fiend in order to gain power, but this contract came at the cost of his memories and then some. Whoever this patron is must just be using Grim for their own goals, and Grim doesn't know it because he can't remember the dealing. Yet everything he's been doing has inadvertently helped this entity, or perhaps these actions have been subtly influenced by this entity. I'm really excited to see what becomes of Grim in the main story because he's such an interesting little mystery at present, and I think in a D&D context he'd make a really interesting campaign character with a lot of play in his uncertain backstory that could create a very compelling, overarching story. I hope that twst does something interesting with him and that we get this sort of compelling narrative, but for today and this consideration, he's going to be a warlock with a mysterious fiend patron, and that's all there is to him. And with that, we've come to the end of this consideration. As always, I'm curious if you've agreed with my takes or have some differing opinions, so please let me know down below. And while you're there, let me know if you enjoyed this video and want more content like it. If comments aren't your thing, you could always leave a like or maybe even a subscribe. But before you go, I just have to remind you that you're amazing and I hope you have a wonderful day.